Hello, everyone. Tonight we are going to dive into something that might sound completely unexpected: medieval beer brewing. It's a story that's been brewing for centuries, pun intended, and one that many of us probably never gave much thought to. The medieval period isn't just about knights in shining armor or castles perched high on mountains. No. It's also a time where beer was in many ways the drink of choice, safer than water, tastier than mead, and often the only thing that kept people alive in a world with little understanding of sanitation. But here's the kicker. You probably think monks were the masters of medieval brewing, right? Well, think again. Nuns brewed the better beer. Now, before you get too comfortable, I'd love to ask you to do something for me. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. I mean, I'd rather have subscribers who are truly into this than just the numbers. And, hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fun to see how far this sleepy history journey can stretch. All right. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soothing background noise, and let's get started tonight. Imagine it's the 12th century, and the world is buzzing with activity. The air is filled with the scent of freshly baked breadwood smoke and the unmistakable earthy smell of the countryside. You're walking down a narrow medieval street, the cobblestones beneath your feet worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The sound of distant bells from a nearby monastery chimes in the background as you make your way to a small tavern for a drink. What's on offer? Beer, of course. In medieval Europe, beer wasn't just a recreational beverage, it was a staple of daily life. Whether you were a lowly peasant or a noble king, beer was a drink you could trust. It might sound strange to our modern ears, but in the medieval world, water could be deadly. Without modern sanitation, the local wells were often contaminated, leading to frequent outbreaks of disease. But beer was different. Brewing it didn't just make it taste good, it made it safer. The fermentation process killed harmful bacteria, making beer the drink of choice for almost everyone. If you wanted something safe, to drink something that wouldn't make you sick, you turned to beer. It was as common as bread and as essential to daily life as well-breathing. Now, we know what you're probably thinking beer was for everyone, sure. But didn't monks brew the best beer? And yes, while it's true that monks have been celebrated for their brewing skills, especially in monasteries like those of the Trappist order, what isn't as commonly known is that nuns were equally skilled in the art of brewing, and in many cases they brewed beer that was considered superior. That's right, nuns. The women of the cloistered convents were the true brewing masters of the medieval period. You might be wondering, wait a minute. How could nuns who were busy with prayer manage to outbrew monks who dedicated their entire lives to the craft? Well, buckle up, because the story is far more interesting than you might think. Monasteries, as you know, were centers of learning discipline and productivity. Monks were known for their brewing practices, creating beer, not only for their own consumption, but also to support the monastery's work. The beer they brewed was often sold to fund religious projects or maintain the monastic lifestyle. It was a business as much as it was a spiritual practice. The monks focused on beer for sustenance, often brewing large quantities for themselves, the local community, and pilgrims who passed through. While the monks' beer was certainly good, it was typically a more straightforward affair, hearty strong, and, for lack of a better word, functional. But in convents, things were a little different. Nuns operating in smaller, quieter spaces had the advantage of time and space to perfect their brewing process. Whereas the monks were sometimes constrained by the sheer scale of their brewing operations, nuns had the luxury of focusing on the finer details. Brewing beer wasn't just about producing a large quantity, it was about producing quality, and that's where the nuns excelled. They approached brewing with a level of care and attention to detail that went beyond mere necessity. Historians still debate whether it was truly the nuns' superior brewing techniques or simply their access to better ingredients that gave them an edge. But one thing is clear. The nuns of medieval Europe were not only great beer brewers, but innovators in the craft. They developed advanced brewing methods that produced a cleaner, more refined beer, compared to the monks' rustic brews. Some convents even brewed beer with added herbs and spices, crafting brews that were both medicinal and delicious. In a world where illness was widespread and medicine was often rudimentary at best, nuns began to experiment with brewing as a way to both nourish and heal. But that's not all. Nuns also had an intimate knowledge of herbalism and apothecary practices, which played a key role in their brewing process. While monks might have relied on simple barley and hops, nuns incorporated various herbs, flowers, and even medicinal roots into their beer. These ingredients didn't just add flavor, they also had healing properties, making the nuns' beers not only refreshing but potentially therapeutic. Now, there's one more thing that made the nuns stand out in the brewing game: economics. While monks brewed primarily for survival and the upkeep of their religious practices, nuns saw brewing as an opportunity to generate income for their convents, and they were successful at it. Nuns brewed beer not only for their own consumption, but also for sale. Their convents became self-sustaining, and their beers became sought after by locals. These nuns were running profitable beer businesses in addition to their spiritual duties, and their brewing skills became well known throughout Europe. Historians still argue about whether nuns truly brewed better beer, with some claiming that their brewing techniques were more refined than those of the monks. But what is indisputable is that nuns played a significant role in the history of brewing in medieval Europe, and their contributions shouldn't be overlooked. So next time you crack open a cold one, just remember that the women of the convents were the unsung heroes of the medieval beer world. Section 2. Beer in the Dark Ages, Liquid Life. When you think of medieval Europe, the first images that likely come to mind are knights in armor castles and perhaps some iconic battles. But in reality, much of the medieval world revolved around more mundane yet crucial aspects of life: food, shelter, and of course, beer. Yes, beer was more than just a drink. It was a lifeline, a liquid staple of life that played a key role in the daily survival of nearly everyone, from peasants working the fields to royalty lounging in their castles. In a world where clean water was often unavailable, beer was the go-to drink. Water sources were easily contaminated by human and animal waste, making drinking water a risky proposition. But beer was safer. Brewing beer involves fermentation, a process that kills off harmful bacteria and microorganisms, making it a relatively safe alternative to drinking water, especially in areas where sanitation was lacking. Think of it as the medieval version of bottled water, only a lot tastier and a lot more alcohol-laden. But the role of beer in medieval society wasn't just about survival. It was deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the time. Almost every community, whether urban or rural, had its own local brewery where beer was brewed for daily consumption. For the peasants, beer was a meal in itself. A heavy, calorie-dense beverage, it could sustain them through a long day of work in the fields. For the nobility and the clergy, it was both a social lubricant and a luxury. In fact, the brewing of beer often served as a vital part of a community's economic engine. Monasteries, which were often at the center of local economies, would brew beer not only for the consumption of their own monks, but also for sale to raise funds for their religious activities and charitable work. Beer was consumed at almost every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. People drank beer not because they were necessarily thirsty, but because it was safer and more nourishing than the alternatives. In fact, beer was so integral to daily life that it was sometimes referred to as liquid bread, given its caloric content and its role in providing sustenance. It was also a drink enjoyed by nearly everyone from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. Men, women, and children alike would partake in beer, albeit in varying quantities. This was especially true for children who were often given small amounts of beer mixed with water, as it was considered healthier than drinking water straight from the local well. For monks, brewing beer was often part of their spiritual life. As strange as it may sound to modern ears, brewing was a sacred activity for many religious orders. In fact, some monasteries became famous for their beer-making abilities. The Trappist monks, for example, brewed some of the finest beers in all of Europe, a tradition that continues today. The process of brewing beer, like many other activities in monastic life, was considered an act of devotion. The monks would pour all their energy into perfecting the brewing process, often crafting beer with specific recipes passed down through generations. For them, the creation of beer wasn't just about making a profit or sustaining themselves, it was an expression of their dedication to their faith. In this context, the nuns of the time were operating in a very similar vein. Like the monks, they were dedicated to their religious duties. But unlike the monks, they were often in a position where they had the freedom and time to experiment with different brewing techniques and ingredients. While monks were often constrained by the larger scale of their operations, nuns, working in smaller, more intimate convents, had more room to explore. The more relaxed atmosphere of the convents allowed the nuns to perfect their craft, experimenting with herbs, spices, and other ingredients that could elevate the flavor and quality of their beers. The results were brews that were often more refined and complex than those of the monks. Historians still debate the exact reasons why nuns' beers were considered superior. Some believe it was the ingredients themselves, sourced from convent gardens, filled with herbs and medicinal plants. Others argue that the nuns' smaller-scale operations allowed them to focus on the quality of the beer, rather than just producing large quantities. Whatever the reason, it is clear that the nuns were doing something right. Their beer became highly sought after, and convent breweries began to rival those of the monks in both quality and popularity. It wasn't just the brewing process that made beer so important in medieval society, it was also a social glue. Beer was consumed communally, and drinking it often involved socializing, bonding, and establishing connections. In taverns, the local pub, or even at feasts, people gathered over mugs of beer, talking business, exchanging gossip, or celebrating victories in battle. This communal aspect of beer consumption was an essential part of the fabric of medieval life. For the monasteries and convents, beer became a way to interact with the local population, raising their profile in the community, and ensuring a steady flow of income. As we continue to explore the fascinating world of medieval brewing, it's important to recognize the role of beer as not only a dietary necessity, but also as a cornerstone of social and economic life. The nuns, with their keen attention to detail and innovative brewing techniques, were well positioned to take advantage of this thriving market. By honing their craft and developing new methods of brewing, they managed to produce beer that was not only a means of sustenance but also a product of pride. So, next time you crack open a cold one, Just remember you're drinking more than just a beverage. You're sipping on a piece of history. Beer was the lifeblood of medieval society, and the women of the convents had a hand in making sure that the brew was both delicious and life-sustaining. Section 3. The monastic tradition. In medieval Europe, monastic communities were some of the most important centers of learning, culture, and economic activity. These monasteries were not just places of prayer and contemplation. They were also centers of productivity, where monks engaged in agricultural work, manuscript copying, and, of course, brewing. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and Trappists, among others, all became famous for their brewing techniques, which played a crucial role in sustaining their communities and generating income. The brewing of beer in monasteries was not just a business, it was a religious practice. For monks, brewing was often seen as an act of devotion. It was a way of serving God and the community, and many monks believed that brewing beer allowed them to fulfill their monastic vows of labor and self-sufficiency. The monastic life, with its emphasis on discipline and simplicity, naturally extended to the brewing process. The monks were meticulous about the ingredients they used, and the techniques they employed, ensuring that each batch of beer was crafted with care and precision. Beer in the monastic tradition wasn't just about providing a drink for the monks. It was also about providing sustenance for the broader community. As mentioned earlier, the medieval world lacked proper sanitation, and water was often unsafe to drink. Beer, however, was safer and more reliable. As a result, monasteries became key players in the production of beer for the surrounding villages, towns, and cities. Not only did this ensure a steady supply of safe drinking options, but it also provided the monastery with a steady stream of income which was used to fund religious activities, charity work, and the upkeep of the monastic estate. Monasteries often had large brewing operations, and the beer produced was generally sold to raise funds for the order. While many of the beers produced by monks were hearty dark ales, often with a high alcohol content to help preserve them, the focus was more on quantity rather than quality. Monasteries, due to their size and scale, often found themselves brewing beer in vast quantities. As such, their brewing process was more focused on efficiency than experimentation. Though monks took great care in selecting their ingredients, the sheer volume of beer they needed to produce meant that their brews were sometimes less refined than those of their female counterparts in convents. In addition to brewing beer, monasteries were also involved in the production of other beverages such as wine and mead. Many monks were skilled in viticulture and brewing, applying their knowledge of fermentation to a variety of products. However, it was beer that was most closely associated with monastic life. The process of brewing beer in a monastery was often a communal activity. Monks would work together to prepare the ingredients, boil the wort, and monitor the fermentation process. This communal aspect of brewing helped to foster a sense of unity and shared purpose within the monastery. The monks' involvement in brewing beer was not just about sustenance. It was also about following the traditions of the monastic orders. Brewing beer, much like the act of farming, was seen as a way to maintain the rhythms of monastic life. It was a means of honoring the work of God by providing for the needs of the community and ensuring that the monastery remained self-sufficient. Historians still debate how much influence monks had over the development of beer styles in the medieval period. While it's clear that monks were important figures in the early development of brewing, it's also evident that their beers were somewhat more basic compared to the refined brews crafted by nuns in their smaller convents. Some argue that monks' beers were too hearty and rough, while others maintain that the sheer volume of beer they brewed made it difficult to focus on refining the product. Regardless of the reasons, it is clear that monks were integral to the spread of brewing techniques and the establishment of the beer industry in Europe. As the centuries passed, the brewing tradition in monasteries continued to evolve. By the time the early modern period arrived, many monastic orders had begun to refine their brewing processes, producing more sophisticated and varied styles of beer. These innovations paved the way for the modern brewing industry, which would eventually grow into the multi-billion-dollar global enterprise it is today. However, despite their contributions to brewing, monks did not have the same level of success as nuns when it came to beer quality. As we'll soon explore, it was in the quieter, smaller spaces of convents where brewing innovation truly flourished. The nuns, with their closer attention to detail and more individualized approach, were able to craft beers that stood out for their exceptional quality and flavor. While monks were brewing vast quantities of beer to meet the demands of their communities, nuns were honing their craft producing beers that were both functional and refined. In many ways, the contrast between the monks and nuns reflects the different approaches to brewing in their respective environments. Monasteries were bustling, often crowded places where efficiency and quantity took precedence over quality. Convents, by contrast, were smaller, more intimate communities, where nuns had the space and time to experiment with different brewing techniques and ingredients. This difference in scale and approach was key to the nuns' success in producing superior beer. Despite the monks' early dominance in the brewing world, it was the nuns who would ultimately leave a lasting legacy in the beer industry. Their innovation, attention to detail, and ability to craft unique brews helped to shape the future of beer production in ways that the monks could never have predicted. Section 4. Nuns and the Art of Brewing. When you think about the medieval brewing industry, the image that often comes to mind is that of monks in their monasteries carefully crafting beer with centuries-old recipes. And while monks certainly played an important role in the history of brewing, there's another lesser-known group that deserves credit for perfecting the craft: nuns. While monks focused on large-scale production brewing in monasteries with a practical goal of self-sufficiency and economic support, nuns had the opportunity to refine their methods in smaller, quieter convents. It was within these more intimate settings that nuns created beers that were not just functional, but superior in quality, flavor, and sometimes medicinal value. In many ways, the success of nun-brewed beer came down to the environment in which it was brewed. Monasteries were large, bustling centers of life. Monks had many duties: farming, copying manuscripts, praying, and of course, brewing beer. Their brewing operations were often big, focused on quantity, and driven by the need to sustain not only the monks, but also the surrounding community. As a result, while monks brewed beer that was crucial for survival, their focus was more on the volume of production rather than the refinement of flavor. On the other hand, convents were smaller, more peaceful places, and the nuns there had the freedom to focus on the finer details of their brewing. Nuns didn't have the same pressure to produce beer in large quantities, so they had more time to experiment with different ingredients and techniques. This focus on quality over quantity allowed them to develop beer that was more refined, often using herbal ingredients and spices that set their brews apart. The nuns' access to convent gardens filled with herbs, flowers, and medicinal plants provided them with a wealth of natural ingredients to add to their beer. Unlike the monks, whose brewing practices were often standardized and utilitarian, nuns had the opportunity to create beers that were both functional and luxurious. Nuns weren't just brewing beer for the sake of it, they were honing an art form. Brewing, much like cooking, was a skill that required creativity, attention to detail, and an understanding of how different flavors and ingredients worked together. For the nuns, Brewing was an expression of their devotion not just to God, but also to their community. It wasn't just about making a product that could be sold for income. It was about creating something that brought joy and nourishment to the people who drank it. The nuns' beer was often brewed with ingredients that were either homegrown in their convent gardens or sourced from local markets. These ingredients could range from simple grains like barley and oats to more exotic herbs and spices. Some convents specialized in brewing beers that had medicinal properties using herbs like chamomile thyme and rosemary to help with digestion, or adding honey and fruit to create a more complex flavor profile. The use of herbs and spices in brewing was not just a way to enhance the flavor. It was also a way to infuse the beer with healing properties, a trait that set the nuns' beers apart from the more basic brews of the monks. It's important to understand that the nuns' approach to brewing wasn't just about making beer taste better. It was also about making beer that was beneficial to the health of the drinker. At the time, beer was often consumed as a substitute for water, which was frequently contaminated with diseases. But beer brewed by nuns with its inclusion of medicinal herbs could help to soothe the stomach, promote digestion, and even heal ailments. For people living in an age without modern medicine, a bottle of nun-brewed beer wasn't just a refreshing beverage. It could also be seen as a form of treatment, a therapeutic tool that helped keep the body in balance. This focus on the healing properties of beer is part of what made nuns such skilled brewers. They didn't just view brewing as a way to make money or produce something functional. They saw it as an act of care for their fellow community members. For the nuns, brewing was a way to serve others, and the quality of the beer they produced reflected their commitment to that service. The beers they brewed were a blend of art, science, and care, and that made them stand out in a world where beer was primarily seen as a commodity. Historians still debate why the beer brewed by nuns was considered to be superior to that of the monks. Some suggest that it was the nuns' use of herbs and spices, while others argue that it was simply the more refined brewing techniques they employed. One thing is clear, though. The nuns' focus on quality allowed them to craft beers that were not only functional, but also a joy to drink. They had the luxury of time and resources to experiment with flavors, which allowed them to create beers that were smoother, more balanced, and more flavorful than the brews made by monks in larger, more industrialized operations. Nuns also had an understanding of fermentation that allowed them to produce cleaner beers. Fermentation, which was critical to brewing, was a complex process that required patience and care. The nuns, with their attention to detail and smaller-scale operations, were able to monitor the fermentation process more closely, ensuring that their beer was clear and free from off flavors. While monks might have relied on more rudimentary brewing techniques, the nuns' beers benefited from their ability to control the fermentation process with precision. It wasn't just the taste and quality of the beer that made nuns such skilled brewers, it was the entire process. From the selection of ingredients to the brewing method and the final product, the nuns' approach to beer making was a labor of love infused with creativity and care. While monks were brewing beer as part of a larger religious and economic system, nuns were crafting beer as an expression of their devotion, a reflection of their commitment to the well-being of their community. Today, many of the brewing techniques pioneered by nuns have been lost to history, but their influence can still be felt in the craft beer world. Nuns' beers were a precursor to modern artisanal brewing, with an emphasis on quality flavor and creativity. The nuns may have been overlooked in history, but their contributions to brewing are undeniable. By now, you've probably already got the picture. Monks were indeed important figures in medieval brewing, but perhaps not for the reasons you thought. While it's true that monastic breweries are often lauded for their historical contributions, there's more to the monks' brewing operations than meets the eye. Monks were widely known for brewing vast quantities of beer, but many historical accounts overlook the fact that their focus was not necessarily on fine-tuning the flavor or exploring creative ingredients. Instead, monks were more concerned with sustaining their own communities and ensuring that they were self-sufficient. One of the central aspects of monastic brewing was its sheer scale. Monasteries were large institutions, often with hundreds of monks living and working on the property. Brewing beer was essential not only for the monks' own consumption, but also for their ability to fund their religious and charitable activities. In order to support their large populations, monks would need to brew beer in quantities large enough to sustain the whole community. As a result, their brewing operations were often massive, with large vats of beer being prepared to meet the demands of the monastery's inhabitants and visitors alike. But with great quantity often comes a sacrifice in quality. The monks' brewing operations were built for efficiency and scale, which meant that the beer produced was often less refined. While monks certainly brewed excellent beer, it was brewed more for sustenance than for flavor. The large volume of beer they needed to produce made it difficult to focus on the finer details of the brewing process, and as such, their beer tended to be a bit rough around the edges. The focus on sheer production meant that the monks did not have the time or resources to experiment with the finer points of brewing that would have allowed them to produce the more complex, flavorful beers that nuns were able to craft. There were other practical considerations that influenced the monks' approach to brewing as well. For example, the monks' beer was often brewed to be stronger and more calorically dense. In a time when food was not always abundant, especially during the colder months, beer provided a valuable source of nourishment. By brewing beer with a higher alcohol content, monks could create a beverage that was both a source of hydration and a source of energy. This type of beer was particularly useful during Lent, when monks would fast from solid food and rely on liquids like beer to sustain them. While the beer brewed by monks was undeniably an essential part of their daily lives, the focus was largely on practicality. The brewing process was a means to an end, ensuring that the monks had enough beer to drink while also generating income for the monastery. The monks' beers were hearty, strong, and relatively simple, but they were never meant to be works of art. The sheer size and volume of their operations simply didn't leave room for experimentation. And, unlike the nuns who had the freedom to create more refined beers, the monks were constrained by the practicalities of their monastic lifestyle. Monks were also often bound by the traditional recipes and methods passed down through their order. Brewing was done in a very regimented manner, following established guidelines that prioritized consistency over innovation. The result was a beer that was dependable and consistent, but perhaps not as complex or flavorful as the more innovative beers brewed by nuns. In a way, this adherence to tradition became a double-edged sword for the monks. While it allowed them to brew beer that was reliable and efficient, it also stifled creativity. The nuns, by contrast, had more freedom to experiment and refine their brewing techniques, which allowed them to produce beers that were often seen as superior in both taste and quality. The monks' focus on the practical aspects of brewing also led to some interesting quirks in the process. For example, the beer brewed in monasteries was often cloudy and unrefined, as the monks did not have the time or resources to perfect the clarity of the beer. This lack of attention to detail in the brewing process contributed to the somewhat rustic nature of the beer. While the monks' beer was often very strong and rich in flavor, It lacked the smoothness and refinement that could have been achieved with a more delicate approach. Historians still debate whether monks' beers were truly inferior to those of the nuns. Some argue that the monks' larger operations allowed them to produce beer on a scale that was unmatched by nuns, while others claim that the nuns' smaller, more intimate brewing environments allowed them to produce beer that was superior in terms of both quality and flavor. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Monks were excellent brewers in their own right, but their focus was more on practicality and quantity rather than creativity and refinement. Despite these differences, the monks' contribution to brewing is undeniable. Their large-scale brewing operations laid the foundation for the development of the modern brewing industry. The methods and techniques they developed for brewing beer were passed down through the generations and influenced the evolution of beer making in Europe. While the nuns' beers may have been more refined, the monks were the ones who truly built the infrastructure for the brewing industry. They created the systems, processes, and institutions that would eventually allow beer to become a widely available and beloved beverage. In the end, the monks' beers were less about perfection and more about necessity. They brewed beer to survive, to nourish, and to fund their religious activities. While the nuns may have brewed better beer, the monks were the ones who made beer a staple of medieval life. Without the monks' contributions, it's unlikely that beer would have become as integral to European society as it did. So, while monks may not have been the masters of brewing in the way that nuns were, their role in the development of beer should not be overlooked. Section 6. Nuns Brewing Innovations, Crafting Perfection. While the monks were busy brewing beer on a large scale to meet the demands of their communities, the nuns in their smaller, quieter convents had the luxury of focusing on the finer points of the brewing process. This attention to detail, combined with their unique access to resources, allowed nuns to develop brewing techniques that produced beer that was not only functional, but superior in taste and quality. Nuns didn't just brew to survive, they brewed with a passion for perfection. And, as we'll see, their innovative brewing practices set them apart from their male counterparts. One of the main advantages that nuns had in their brewing operations was the size of their convents. While monasteries were large, often housing dozens or even hundreds of monks, convents were smaller, more intimate spaces. This allowed the nuns to work in quieter, less distracting environments where they could experiment with different ingredients, processes, and methods. Brewing beer was a meticulous process that required both patience and precision qualities that the nuns had in abundance. With fewer people to feed and less pressure to produce beer on a massive scale, nuns had the time to focus on refining their brewing methods. Perhaps the most important innovation introduced by nuns was their use of herbs and other botanicals in their brewing. Nuns had access to convent gardens, which were filled with medicinal plants, herbs and flowers that could be used in brewing to enhance flavor and improve the beer's health benefits. While monks were more likely to use a basic combination of barley and hops, nuns took advantage of the many plants available to them, adding ingredients like chamomile, rosemary, thyme, and even fruit to their brews. These added ingredients not only improved the flavor of the beer, but also gave it unique properties such as aiding digestion or soothing the stomach. In medieval Europe, the importance of medicinal herbs could not be overstated. In a time when modern medicine was either non-existent or rudimentary at best, herbs were often used for their therapeutic properties. By incorporating these herbs into their beers, nuns were able to craft beverages that were both flavorful and beneficial to health. Nuns understood that beer could be more than just a drink. It could be a remedy, a way to alleviate ailments and promote well-being. As a result, many of the beers brewed by nuns were considered to have medicinal value, making them even more desirable to the people who consumed them. But it wasn't just the ingredients that made the nuns' beer so remarkable, it was also their brewing techniques. Nuns were known for their careful attention to the fermentation process, ensuring that each batch of beer was brewed to perfection. While monks often focused on the quantity of beer produced, nuns were concerned with the quality of the product. They understood the science of fermentation and were able to monitor the process closely to ensure that the beer was free from off flavors and impurities. This attention to detail resulted in beer that was smoother, cleaner, and more refined than the beer brewed by their male counterparts. One of the key aspects of brewing beer is fermentation, and it was in this area that the nuns excelled. Fermentation is a delicate process that requires careful monitoring of temperature, humidity, and the fermentation time. Nuns, working in smaller batches and with less pressure to produce large quantities, were able to devote more time to perfecting this crucial stage of the brewing process. As a result, their beers were often clearer and less cloudy than those brewed by monks, and they had a more consistent taste and quality. The use of herbs and their focus on refining the fermentation process weren't the only innovations that set the nuns apart in the brewing world. Nuns also became adept at creating beers with varying levels of alcohol content, allowing them to cater to a wider range of tastes and needs. Some beers brewed by nuns were light and refreshing, perfect for drinking during the day, while others were strong and rich, meant for colder months or for medicinal purposes. This variety made nun-brewed beer a versatile product that could be enjoyed by people of all social classes. Another innovation that nuns introduced to brewing was the use of specialized yeast strains. Yeast is the microorganism that facilitates the fermentation of sugars into alcohol, and it plays a crucial role in the flavor and quality of beer. Nuns were known to experiment with different types of yeast, allowing them to create beers with unique flavor profiles. This experimentation with yeast strains helped to elevate their brewing to an art form. Monks, by contrast, were often more conservative in their approach to yeast, relying on traditional methods that were more focused on consistency than on flavor variation. The nuns' creativity in brewing was not just limited to the ingredients and techniques they used, it extended to the very design of their brewing operations. Convents often had smaller, more specialized brewing rooms that were designed to create an ideal environment for fermentation. These rooms were kept at a constant temperature, and the brewing equipment was often custom designed to fit the needs of the nuns' operations. This level of attention to detail and specialization helped to ensure that each batch of beer was brewed to the highest standard. One of the reasons why nuns were able to achieve such high levels of innovation in their brewing practices was their relative autonomy. Unlike monks who were often bound by the rules and traditions of their monastic orders, nuns had more freedom to experiment with new ideas. While the monks followed a set of established brewing methods, the nuns were free to innovate, incorporating new ingredients, techniques, and equipment into their brewing practices. This flexibility allowed nuns to push the boundaries of what was possible in brewing, creating beers that were both more refined and more diverse than those brewed in the monasteries. Despite the many advantages that nuns had in brewing, their contributions to the brewing industry have often been overlooked. The nuns' beers were seen as niche products brewed in small batches for local consumption, while the monks' beers were mass-produced and widely distributed. As a result, the nuns' contributions to brewing were often relegated to the background, overshadowed by the larger, more well-known brewing operations in the monasteries. However, in recent years there has been a growing recognition of the nuns' role in shaping the beer industry. Their innovative techniques, use of herbs, and attention to detail helped to lay the foundation for the craft beer movement that would emerge centuries later. In conclusion, the nuns were the unsung pioneers of brewing. Their innovations in ingredients fermentation and yeast cultivation helped to elevate the craft of brewing to new heights. Their beers were not just functional, they were works of art, crafted with care, creativity, and devotion. While monks may have laid the groundwork for the brewing industry, it was the nuns who truly perfected the craft. Section 7. The economics of brewing in convents versus monasteries. Brewing beer in medieval Europe was about more than just quenching thirst. It was a key economic strategy for both monasteries and convents. But while both monks and nuns turned brewing into a financial endeavor, the economic models in monasteries and convents were vastly different. This divergence in approach played a significant role in the ultimate success of nun-brewed beer, which, as we've discussed, was often considered superior to that of the monks. Understanding the economics of brewing in these religious communities helps shed light on why the nuns were able to craft beers of exceptional quality while also achieving economic independence. In the large monastic institutions such as Benedictine or Trappist monasteries, the scale of brewing was massive. Monks brewed beer not just for themselves, but for the surrounding community, and for travelers, pilgrims, and people in need. Because monasteries housed large populations of monks, often numbering in the hundreds, brewing beer on a large scale was necessary to support their community. In this system, the economic success of brewing was directly tied to its scale. The more beer they brewed, the more revenue they could generate to support their religious activities, fund the upkeep of the monastery, and contribute to the broader local economy. The beer produced in monasteries was often sold in large quantities, with a focus on making sure that their supply met the demand. This focus on quantity meant that the beer itself was often simpler. No time for experimentation or fine-tuning. The monks' operations were designed for efficiency, ensuring that the brewing process could run smoothly, and that the finished product could be produced and distributed quickly. While this approach allowed the monks to generate revenue and sustain their communities, it didn't leave much room for innovation or quality refinement. Contrast this with the convents, where the scale of operations was smaller, and the nuns had more freedom to explore brewing as both a craft and a business. Many convents had fewer residents, and the brewing operations were often smaller in scale, which allowed the nuns to focus more on producing high-quality beer rather than just large quantities. In some ways, this more intimate environment fostered creativity. Nuns had the time and resources to experiment with ingredients like herbs, flowers, and spices, which helped to set their beers apart from the more utilitarian offerings of the monks. Moreover, since their beer was brewed in smaller quantities, it could be sold at a higher price point, making it a profitable venture for the convents. What's fascinating here is that nuns were able to achieve economic success by producing superior beer with a focus on quality rather than sheer volume. This allowed them to run financially successful brewing operations without relying on large-scale production. As a result, nuns were able to develop more sustainable and independent economic models. Convents often became self-sustaining entities, with income from beer sales helping to support the community and fund the convent's religious and charitable activities. In some cases, the sale of beer was so profitable that it allowed convents to fund projects that furthered their religious mission, or even established independent economies that were separate from the financial oversight of their male counterparts in monasteries. Furthermore, beer sales weren't just a source of income, they also allowed convents to develop relationships with the local community. Monasteries were often isolated, and while their beer was widely sold, monks were less likely to engage in day-to-day interactions with the local populace. Convents, on the other hand, played an active role in their local economies. Nuns frequently interacted with the townspeople who bought their beer, fostering a sense of connection and community. In many ways, the brewing of beer was a vehicle for building relationships with the outside world. The nuns' beer wasn't just about generating income, it was a way to engage with the people they served, providing both a physical product and a form of social interaction that reinforced the nuns' role in the broader community. This personal connection to their customers, combined with the superior quality of the beer, helped make nun-brewed beer highly sought after. People didn't just buy beer from the convent because it was convenient, they bought it because it was considered special. The nuns' beers were often sold at higher prices, with customers willing to pay a premium for the more refined and flavorful brews. In this way, the nuns' brewing operations were not only profitable, but they helped to establish the convents as respected institutions in the local economy. In contrast, the monks' focus on brewing beer for sheer volume meant that their beer wasn't typically viewed as a luxury product. While their beer was an essential part of the monastic economy, it wasn't known for its refinement. Monks brewed beer in large batches to meet demand, and their operations were set up to maximize efficiency. As a result, the beer brewed in monasteries was often sold at a lower price, and its quality, while good, wasn't as consistently high as the beer brewed by nuns. Economically speaking, this difference in approach had significant consequences. Monasteries with their large-scale operations were heavily dependent on the mass production of beer to sustain themselves, while convents were more agile, producing beer that appealed to a smaller but more lucrative market. The nuns' ability to craft superior beer, coupled with their ability to run profitable brewing operations on a smaller scale, allowed them to thrive in an economic environment that favored innovation and quality over sheer output. The economics of brewing in convents and monasteries also reflected the broader differences between the two religious communities. Monasteries were designed to support large communal living, with a focus on survival and self-sufficiency. Brewing beer was a means to an end, sustaining the monks and funding the monastery's religious work. For nuns, however, brewing was both a spiritual and economic pursuit. Their smaller scale allowed them to focus on quality, and their independence allowed them to explore new ways of generating income. The success of nun-brewed beer was a testament to their ability to balance the spiritual and the practical, creating a product that was both economically successful and artistically refined. In conclusion, the nuns' success in brewing wasn't just a matter of skill. It was a result of the unique economic model they operated under. By focusing on quality rather than quantity, they were able to create a product that not only supported their community, but also allowed them to establish financial independence. The beer brewed by nuns wasn't just a necessity, it was a luxury, and this made it highly sought after by the local community. In contrast, the monks' larger operations were built on efficiency and scale, which resulted in beer that was more functional than refined. This contrast in economic strategies played a crucial role in the success of nun-brewed beer. Section 8. The Gendered Divide. Why nuns brewed better. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval brewing, we find that one of the most significant factors in the success of nun-brewed beer lies not just in their brewing techniques or economic strategies, but in the gendered divide that existed between nuns and monks. Gender roles during the medieval period were rigid, and the lives of nuns and monks were shaped by very different expectations and social structures. Understanding these differences can help us appreciate why nuns were able to perfect the art of brewing in ways that monks could not, despite their shared religious commitment and brewing history. In the context of the medieval world, gender was a key factor in determining the responsibilities and opportunities available to individuals. Monasteries were large, often male-dominated institutions, where monks were expected to devote themselves fully to the religious and practical work of the monastery. Their lives were structured around communal living and religious duties, and their brewing operations were designed to sustain these large, often hierarchical communities. Monks working in large groups were focused on efficiency and productivity, and their brewing was centered on fulfilling the basic needs of the monastery and its inhabitants. While monks were certainly skilled brewers, their work was driven by the demands of their larger community, not by the opportunity to explore creative or refined brewing techniques. In contrast, nuns lived in smaller, more intimate convents. While their religious duties were just as demanding as those of monks, convent life was often quieter, and the nuns had more freedom to experiment with their brewing processes. Their smaller scale of operation meant that they didn't face the same pressures to produce large quantities of beer. With fewer nuns to support and less urgency to produce massive quantities, they had the time and space to explore and perfect the art of brewing. This more flexible, relaxed environment allowed nuns to approach brewing not just as a means of survival, but as an opportunity for artistic expression and innovation. The gendered divide between monks and nuns also shaped the ways in which brewing was perceived and practiced. In a patriarchal society, men were often given greater access to resources, authority, and recognition. The monks' large-scale brewing operations were a reflection of the male-dominated nature of monastic life, while nuns' more refined brewing practices were often overlooked or dismissed. Nuns, as women in a patriarchal society, were not afforded the same status or recognition as their male counterparts, which meant that their contributions to brewing were frequently downplayed or erased from history. However, this gendered dynamic worked in the nuns' favor when it came to brewing, because convents where smaller nuns had more control over the brewing process. The lack of oversight from higher ecclesiastical authorities meant that nuns were freer to experiment with new ingredients, develop unique techniques, and create distinctive flavors. They didn't have to adhere to the rigid rules and traditions that governed the monks' brewing, and this gave them the creative freedom to perfect their craft. The result was a type of beer that was more refined, more flavorful, and often more medicinal than the beer brewed by monks. Nuns also had an intimate knowledge of herbs, which was a natural extension of their religious and social roles. In medieval Europe, women were often the primary caregivers and healers in their communities, and many nuns were skilled in herbalism and medicine. Their knowledge of medicinal plants made its way into their brewing practices, with nuns using a variety of herbs and flowers to enhance the flavor and health benefits of their beer. This attention to the medicinal properties of beer was not something that monks typically focused on. Monks, while skilled brewers, were more concerned with creating large quantities of beer for sustenance, while the nuns, with their more personalized approach, crafted beer that could heal as well as refresh. One of the key factors that allowed nuns to perfect their brewing techniques was their close relationship with nature. Unlike the monks who often worked in large industrialized brewing operations, nuns were able to cultivate their own gardens and access a wide variety of herbs and plants. These gardens became essential to the nuns' brewing operations, providing them with the ingredients they needed to craft flavorful medicinal brews. This deep connection to the land and to the natural world allowed nuns to create beers that were not only more diverse in flavor, but also more beneficial to health. This connection to nature was also reflected in the way nuns approached brewing as a spiritual practice. Brewing for nuns wasn't just a way to support the convent, it was an expression of their devotion to God. Nuns viewed the brewing process as an act of creation, a way to honor God's gifts of nature by transforming the ingredients into something nourishing and healing. Brewing, like other forms of work in the convent, was done in the spirit of service. Nuns saw their work as a way to care for the health and well-being of their fellow nuns, their local community, and anyone who drank their beer. The gendered divide in brewing also had an impact on how the nuns' beers were marketed. Because nuns were often seen as secondary to the monks in religious and economic life, their beers were sometimes perceived as less important or less prestigious. However, this perception worked to the advantage of the nuns in certain ways. Nuns were able to cultivate a more niche, specialized market for their beers. The refined medicinal qualities of their brews combined with the high quality of the beer made nun-brewed beer a luxury product. People were willing to pay more for a bottle of nun-brewed beer because it was seen as a special high-quality product, something that was crafted with care and devotion, not just mass-produced for the sake of efficiency. As a result, nuns were able to carve out a profitable and sustainable business from their brewing operations, despite the historical narrative that often sidelined their contributions. The focus on quality innovation and healing, combined with their ability to create a niche market for their beers, made the nuns' brewing practices an essential part of the medieval economy, even if they were often overshadowed by the more industrialized brewing operations of the monks. In conclusion, the gendered divide between monks and nuns was a crucial factor in the success of nun-brewed beer. The smaller, more intimate environment of convents allowed nuns to refine their brewing techniques, experiment with ingredients, and create high-quality beer that was both flavorful and medicinal. Their knowledge of herbs, their connection to nature, and their freedom from the rigid constraints of monastic life all contributed to the exceptional quality of their brews. Despite the fact that history has often overlooked the contributions of women to the brewing industry, nuns were the true pioneers of refined, innovative beer-making in medieval Europe. Section 9. The Monastic Beer Market. In medieval Europe, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a commodity. Both monks and nuns brewed beer for a variety of reasons: sustenance, religious devotion, and perhaps most importantly, economic survival. The brewing operations within monasteries and convents were not only a means of nourishing their inhabitants, but also a way to generate income. And while we've already explored the differences in the brewing methods of monks and nuns, it's crucial to understand the larger market in which their beers were sold and consumed. Monasteries were often self-sufficient communities that relied on the products they made to sustain their daily lives. They produced everything from food to beer, and the sale of these goods was essential to their economic stability. The beer brewed in monasteries was a significant source of income, and it was sold to local townsfolk, travelers, and pilgrims passing through the area. Pilgrimages to religious sites were common during the medieval period, and these travelers needed food, shelter, and drink. Monasteries capitalized on this demand by providing beer to thirsty pilgrims, often offering their brews as part of a hospitality package. Given the monastery's prime locations near pilgrimage routes, the monks' beer was in high demand and helped support their monastic lifestyle. As the brewing operations grew in size, monasteries became integral players in the medieval beer market. With large populations to feed and visitors to serve, the production of beer was an essential part of the monastery's operation. The beer itself was sold not only to pilgrims, but also to the surrounding community, which helped to create a steady stream of income. The beer brewed in monasteries was reliable, hearty, and relatively simple, which made it a popular choice for the masses. Monks would often brew in large quantities to meet the demands of the market, which in turn allowed them to generate a steady flow of revenue to fund religious activities and maintain the monastery's upkeep. However, while monks dominated the larger market, nuns operated within a very different economic landscape. Convents were typically smaller, and the nuns' brewing operations were much more focused on quality rather than volume. The nuns' beers were often sold locally within the convent's immediate community, and were priced at a premium for their higher quality and distinctive flavors. While monasteries focused on producing a large quantity of beer to meet widespread demand, nuns were able to tap into a more niche market. Their beers were often seen as a luxury item, prized for their superior taste, and sometimes medicinal qualities. Despite their smaller scale, the nuns were highly successful in creating a profitable market for their beer. Convents often became self-sustaining economic units, with the income from beer sales helping to support the religious and charitable activities of the convent. Nuns, by focusing on the premium quality of their beer and marketing it as a special product, carved out a market that was different from that of the monks. Their beer became highly sought after, not just for its taste, but for its perceived health benefits. This gave the nuns a distinct competitive edge in the medieval beer market. In many ways, the nuns' brewing operations were ahead of their time. They were able to tap into the growing demand for more specialized, higher-quality products. The success of nuns in the brewing industry can be seen as a precursor to modern-day craft brewing, where quality flavor and niche markets are prioritized over mass production. By focusing on the details, experimenting with ingredients, refining their brewing techniques, and marketing their beers as luxury items, the nuns were able to create a profitable and sustainable business model that allowed them to thrive in an otherwise male-dominated industry. This contrast between the monks' large-scale brewing operations and the nuns' focus on refined, high-quality products highlights the different approaches to brewing in the medieval period. While monks were primarily concerned with the economics of mass production, nuns took a more personalized approach which allowed them to carve out a profitable niche in the beer market. Their beers were seen as premium products, both flavorful and medicinal, and their smaller-scale brewing operations allowed them to provide customers with a more intimate and specialized experience. The beer market in medieval Europe was also affected by the larger social and religious dynamics of the time. While monks were seen as the traditional brewers, nuns were often overlooked despite their significant contributions to brewing. The patriarchal structure of medieval society meant that women were often relegated to secondary roles, and their contributions were less visible in historical records. As a result, the nuns' role in the beer market was often downplayed or ignored, even though they were producing some of the most refined and sought-after beers of the time. Today, the role of nuns in medieval brewing is often overshadowed by the more well-documented contributions of monks. However, a closer look at the beer market of the time reveals that nuns were not just participants in the brewing industry. They were pioneers. By focusing on quality, experimenting with ingredients, and cultivating a niche market for their beers, the nuns created a legacy that continues to influence brewing today. The craft beer industry, which values artisanal production and unique flavors, owes much to the innovations introduced by the nuns in the medieval period. In conclusion, while monks may have dominated the mass beer market of medieval Europe, it was the nuns who crafted beers that were seen as superior both in quality and taste. Their focus on quality over quantity, coupled with their innovative use of ingredients and their ability to tap into niche markets, allowed them to create a successful and sustainable beer business. The nuns' contribution to the medieval beer market may have been overshadowed by the larger brewing operations of the monks, but their role in shaping the beer industry is undeniable. By producing refined premium beers, nuns not only helped sustain their convents and communities, but also paved the way for the modern craft brewing movement. Section 10. Taste Test. Nun versus Monk. If you've ever found yourself in a conversation about medieval brewing, the image of monks in their beer-filled monasteries likely comes to mind. Their large-scale brewing operations have earned them a reputation for being the primary brewers of the Middle Ages. But when we turn to the nuns, the conversation shifts not only in terms of the quality of the beer they produced, but also in how it compared to the more well-known brews of the monks. So, let's conduct an imaginary taste test between nun-brewed beer and monk-brewed beer to see what made these different brewing approaches stand out in their own right. First, let's start with the monks. Monks were operating on a much larger scale. Their brewing was primarily focused on meeting the needs of the large monastery population, as well as the pilgrims and travelers who would often stop by seeking food and drink. As a result, monks brewed vast quantities of beer to ensure there was enough to go around. Their beers were typically strong, hearty, and satisfying, meant to nourish the body and provide energy for those who drank it. Monks had their brewing down to a science, so to speak. They used traditional methods passed down through their monastic orders, ensuring that the beer was consistent in strength and taste. However, this focus on quantity often meant that there was less room for experimentation. Beer was brewed in large batches, which meant that the monks had to prioritize efficiency over refining flavors. Their beer, while reliable, was often more rustic and robust, with a higher alcohol content to preserve the beer for longer storage. The beer brewed by monks was generally darker and more intense. It was brewed to sustain large groups of people, so it had a stronger flavor profile, sometimes a bit too heavy for casual drinking, but perfect for those who needed a caloric boost during long days of work or spiritual devotion. The monks often brewed beer in bulk, and because they had to meet the demands of a large community, they couldn't always focus on finesse. The taste was dependable and substantial, but sometimes lacking in the refined flavors that nuns were able to achieve. Now, let's turn to the nuns. Operating in smaller, quieter convents, the nuns had the freedom to experiment. They didn't need to brew large quantities of beer, which gave them more room to focus on the finer details of the brewing process. This meant that their beers were typically more refined and balanced. Nuns experimented with different ingredients, herbs, flowers, and fruits, adding complexity and layers to their brews. They weren't just brewing for sustenance, they were brewing for flavor, and this artistic approach allowed them to craft beers that were smoother, cleaner, and often more enjoyable. The nuns' beers were also less overpowering. While monks brewed strong beers to ensure they lasted and provided energy, nuns focused on creating beers that were delicious to drink often with a lighter touch. Their beers were more aromatic, with delicate herbal notes that were absent from the monks' heavier brews. The use of herbs such as rosemary, chamomile, and thyme, which were readily available in convent gardens, made their beers stand out. These added flavors not only made the beer more enjoyable, but also gave it a medicinal quality, which was a key selling point for the nuns' brews. One of the biggest differences between nun-brewed beer and monk-brewed beer was the clarity and smoothness of the beer. Monks, with their larger-scale brewing operations, didn't have the time or resources to refine their beer. Their brews were often cloudy and robust sometimes, with a thicker texture that could be a bit off-putting for those not accustomed to the strong flavor. Nuns, on the other hand, had the luxury of time and smaller batches. Their beer was often clear with a smooth finish that made it easy to drink. The focus on quality allowed them to produce beer that was not only flavorful, but also visually appealing. If we were to compare these two beers side by side, the monk's beer would likely stand out for its strength and substance. It was a beer designed to fulfill a purpose, nourishment, and energy. But the nun's beer would win on flavor and refinement. Their smaller batches and attention to detail allowed them to craft beers that were enjoyable to drink for longer periods of time, with delicate flavors that could be savored. However, it's important to note that the monk's beer, while perhaps lacking in finesse, was still incredibly important in the history of brewing. The large-scale operations of the monks laid the groundwork for the modern beer industry, introducing methods of mass production and making beer accessible to the general public. Their beers were a staple of medieval life, and while they weren't as refined as the nuns' creations, they were still indispensable to the community. In contrast, nuns, with their focus on quality and refinement, created beers that were more of a luxury. Their beers were smaller in quantity, but higher in quality, and they catered to a more discerning market. They were able to carve out a niche for themselves in the beer market by emphasizing the taste, the medicinal properties, and the artistry behind their brewing. As a result, nun-brewed beers were often more expensive and sought after, particularly among those who appreciated the subtleties of brewing. Today, as the craft beer industry continues to grow, we can draw parallels between the nuns' brewing practices and the modern craft brewing movement. Just like the nuns, craft brewers focus on small batches, experimentation with ingredients, and an emphasis on quality over quantity. The nuns may have been brewing centuries ago, but their approach to beer making was ahead of its time. In the end, both the monks and the nuns played vital roles in the history of brewing. The monks' large-scale brewing operations were essential for the survival and sustenance of medieval communities, while the nuns' innovative, refined beers helped elevate the craft and establish new standards of quality. The monk's beer was a symbol of nourishment and energy, while the nun's beer was an expression of creativity and care. Together, they helped shape the future of beer, and their legacy lives on in the diverse world of modern beer making. Section 11. Historians still debate. Nuns or monks? The question of whether nuns truly brewed better beer than monks is one that historians continue to debate. On the surface, the difference in brewing methods between monks and nuns seems obvious. Monks brewed beer in large quantities to sustain their communities, while nuns in smaller convents had more time to focus on refining their beer-making process. Yet the answer to this question is far from simple, and the historical record is filled with contradictions, uncertainties, and omissions that complicate the matter. Let's start with the key issue scale. Monastic brewing operations, particularly in larger Benedictine and Trappist monasteries, were focused on producing large volumes of beer for both the monks themselves and the surrounding community. The sheer scale of their brewing operations allowed them to meet the demands of large populations, often numbering in the hundreds, and pilgrims who passed through the area. The monks, therefore, were more concerned with producing a steady supply of beer than with fine-tuning its flavor or experimenting with ingredients. Their beer was hearty, robust, and reliable, a sustenance drink that could easily last for long periods and provide energy. The monks' brewing methods were well documented and institutionalized. Over time, they perfected brewing techniques designed for consistency and efficiency, ensuring that each batch of beer met the needs of their religious community. These methods were passed down from one generation of monks to the next, and many of the recipes they used are still alive in modern brewing traditions today. The strength and durability of monk-brewed beer were central to its role in sustaining communities, particularly during periods of fasting, when beer could serve as both nourishment and hydration. As such, monks should be recognized for their foundational contributions to brewing. On the other hand, nuns brewed beer in smaller batches, often in quieter, less pressured environments. The smaller scale of convent life meant that nuns had more time to perfect their brewing techniques. They could experiment with different ingredients, including herbs and fruits, which were commonly grown in convent gardens. Their beer was often lighter and more refined than the hearty brews of the monks, and it was prized for its complexity and balance. The nuns focused not just on producing beer as a source of sustenance, but on crafting a beverage that was pleasurable to drink sometimes with medicinal properties. Nuns also had the advantage of time and space. Unlike monks, who were constrained by large-scale operations, nuns could dedicate more attention to the finer points of brewing, whether that was in the fermentation process or the inclusion of healing herbs. The inclusion of these ingredients allowed nuns to brew beers that had both flavor and health benefits. Many of their beers were considered restorative or even medicinal, and they were highly sought after by the local population for their perceived ability to aid digestion and promote general well-being. Yet, for all their innovations, nuns' brewing contributions often went unrecognized. The patriarchal structure of medieval society meant that their efforts were frequently overshadowed by the larger male-dominated brewing operations of the monks. Nuns' brewing was typically confined to smaller local markets where their beers were sold at a premium, but didn't have the same wide-reaching influence as those produced by the monks. Their beers were a luxury higher quality, but less accessible to the general public. Historians today still struggle to determine whether nuns truly brewed better beer than monks. The records are often vague or incomplete, and much of what we know about nun-brewed beer comes from anecdotal accounts or from the archives of convents that kept records of their brewing activities. However, it's clear that nuns were crafting beer that stood apart from that of the monks in terms of quality. The beer brewed by nuns was more refined, often lighter, and more aromatic with a wider variety of ingredients. But whether it was objectively better than the monks' beer depends on one's perspective. The monks' beer was certainly more practical and more consistent, and its strength made it the drink of choice for those needing nourishment. Nuns, on the other hand, brewed beer that was more delicate and flavorful, but with a more selective audience. The debate over which group brewed the better beer may ultimately come down to individual preferences. For someone seeking hearty filling sustenance, the monks' strong brews would have been preferred. But for those who valued refined flavors and the potential health benefits of beer, nun-brewed beer was the clear winner. Both groups played crucial roles in medieval brewing history, and their respective contributions have shaped the modern beer industry in different ways. Moreover, the legacy of both the monks and the nuns lives on in the world of craft beer. Modern brewers, especially those who focus on artisanal methods and high-quality ingredients, can trace their roots back to the traditions established by these religious communities. While monks laid the groundwork for large-scale brewing operations, it was the nuns who, with their focus on quality, helped to establish the concept of brewing as a craft, a tradition that continues to thrive today in the craft beer movement. Historians may never be able to definitively say whether nuns brewed better beer than monks. But one thing is certain, both groups contributed to the evolution of beer making in profound ways. Their different approaches, monks with their large-scale operations and nuns with their more refined, quality-driven methods, have together shaped the rich diversity of beer styles that we enjoy today. The nuns' legacy may have been overlooked for centuries, but with the rise of craft beer, their pioneering role in brewing is finally getting the recognition it deserves. Section 12. Brewmasters versus Apothecaries. Nuns' hidden expertise. When we think about medieval nuns, the image that often comes to mind is one of religious devotion and piety. Yet, behind the cloistered walls of convents, these women were also skilled in many practical and sometimes surprising arts. One of the most fascinating and underappreciated aspects of their lives was their role as brewers, blending religious devotion with practical knowledge of herbalism and medicine. Nuns weren't just beer makers, they were the original apothecaries using their extensive knowledge of plants and herbs to craft brews with medicinal properties that set their beers apart from the brews of the monks. Herbalism was an essential part of medieval life. In a time when modern medicine was either non-existent or rudimentary at best, people relied heavily on herbs and natural remedies to cure ailments and maintain their health. Nuns, who often had access to convent gardens filled with medicinal plants, were among the most knowledgeable herbalists of the era. They were tasked not only with caring for the sick, but also with growing and cultivating plants that could be used to make remedies. This herbal expertise was naturally incorporated into their brewing practices, allowing nuns to create beers that were more than just drinks, they were medicinal tonics. While monks may have had a similar knowledge of herbs, their brewing practices were primarily focused on producing large quantities of beer for sustenance, rather than creating refined and therapeutic brews. The monks' larger scale of operations meant that they didn't have the luxury of focusing on the medicinal qualities of their beers. Their brewing was more functional, driven by the need to produce beer quickly and in large amounts for the monastery and surrounding community. But nuns working in smaller, more intimate convents were able to brew beer with ingredients that not only enhanced the flavor, but also contributed to the drink's health benefits. For instance, many convent gardens contained herbs such as chamomile mint thyme and rosemary plants known for their calming digestive and anti-inflammatory properties. Nuns could easily incorporate these herbs into their brewing, creating beers that were as beneficial as they were flavorful. Chamomile, for example, was known for its ability to soothe the stomach and promote relaxation, making it a perfect addition to a brew, meant for quieting the mind after a long day of prayer. Similarly, mint was used for its digestive benefits, and rosemary was believed to help with memory and circulation. These herbs not only gave nun-brewed beer unique and aromatic flavors, but also turned it into a therapeutic drink, one that could ease ailments and promote general health. The nuns' expertise in herbalism wasn't just about adding herbs to beer for flavor, it was about crafting brews that could serve as natural remedies. Nuns saw their brewing as a form of service to their communities, using their knowledge of herbs to create beers that could heal and restore. In an age when there was little understanding of medicine beyond herbal remedies and prayer, the ability to brew a beer that could aid digestion, alleviate stress, or help with minor ailments was a valuable skill. This medicinal quality made nun-brewed beer highly sought after as people came to recognize not just the flavor, but the potential healing benefits of the brew. This knowledge of both brewing and herbalism made nuns the original brewmasters and apothecaries of medieval Europe. They were not just brewing for profit or for sustenance, they were brewing to heal. The concept of combining beer with herbal medicine was unique to the nuns, and played a large part in setting their beers apart from the more mass-produced utilitarian brews of the monks. The monks, with their focus on large-scale production and efficiency, were less concerned with the therapeutic properties of their beer. while the nuns were able to create something much more refined with both taste and medicinal value in mind. Furthermore, the role of nuns as healers was not confined to the beer they brewed. Many convents acted as hospitals or care centers for the sick, and the nuns were the primary caregivers. They used their knowledge of plants and herbs to treat a wide range of conditions from digestive issues to fevers to stress-related ailments. Their dual role as brewers and apothecaries meant that they were well versed in the use of medicinal plants, not just for brewing but for general health care. The fact that their beers were infused with these herbs allowed them to continue their healing work in a form that was both practical and enjoyable. In modern times, we often think of herbal medicine as something distinct from beer making. But for the nuns of the medieval period, brewing beer was an extension of their healing practice. It was an opportunity to combine their two areas of expertise, herbalism and brewing, into a single product that could nourish and heal. This blend of medicinal knowledge and brewing innovation created beers that were not only superior in flavor, but also beneficial to health, a fact that made nun-brewed beer highly prized in their time. Today, the modern craft beer movement has a resurgence of interest in using herbs and other botanicals in beer making, often for their unique flavors or health benefits. Nuns were ahead of their time in this regard, blending the art of brewing with the science of herbalism long before the idea of using plants in beer became a trendy practice. Their contributions to both the brewing and herbal traditions should not be overlooked, as their beers laid the groundwork for the artisanal and craft beer industries we enjoy today. In conclusion, the nuns were not just brewers, they were skilled apothecaries who used their knowledge of herbs to create beers that were both delicious and medicinal. Their expertise in herbalism, combined with their focus on quality over quantity, allowed them to craft beers that were far more refined than those of the monks. The role of nuns as both brewers and healers helped establish their unique place in the history of brewing, and their legacy continues to influence the craft beer movement today. The art of combining beer with healing herbs was a practice that set the nuns apart from their male counterparts, and it remains a testament to their ingenuity and devotion. Section 13. Sacred and Secular Religion and Brewing. In the medieval world, religion and daily life were intertwined in almost every aspect, including the seemingly mundane act of brewing beer. For both monks and nuns, brewing was not just an economic activity, it was also a deeply religious one. Brewing beer, while providing sustenance for the monastic and convent communities, was also an act of devotion. This connection between sacred duty and secular necessity played a crucial role in shaping the brewing practices of both monks and nuns as they infused their work with spiritual significance. For monks, brewing was viewed as an extension of their monastic vows of labor and self-sufficiency. The Benedictine rule, which governed many monasteries, emphasized the need for monks to support themselves through productive labor. Brewing beer was a practical way to fulfill this directive. Monks believed that brewing, like other forms of labor, was an offering to God. They approached brewing with the same sense of discipline and devotion that they applied to prayer farming and manuscript copying. Brewing beer, then, was not just about making a beverage, it was about contributing to the well-being of the monastic community and the greater good of society. Brewing was seen as an act of service, a means of sustaining both the body and the soul. Monks who followed a strict routine of prayer and work understood the importance of nourishing their bodies with beer that was safer than water, especially during times of fasting. Beer became a symbol of the monastic commitment to the service of God and the community, providing the monks with both physical sustenance and spiritual fulfillment. The beer they brewed was an offering to God, an expression of their devotion and their obedience to the monastic order. In contrast, nuns brewing was similarly rooted in religious devotion, but with a somewhat different focus. While monks brewed beer primarily for the sustainability of the monastery, nuns brewed beer with a deep sense of care for the well-being of both their fellow nuns and the surrounding community. For the nuns, brewing was not just about self-sufficiency. It was about service to others. Nuns were also involved in caring for the sick, and their knowledge of herbs and medicinal plants, which was incorporated into their brewing process, reflected their broader commitment to healing and care. The act of brewing beer became a way for the nuns to provide not only for their own community, but also to extend their religious mission by offering a drink that was both nourishing and restorative. The sacred nature of beer brewing was also reflected in the rituals surrounding the production process. For both monks and nuns, brewing beer was often done with great care and reverence. It was not just about mixing ingredients and fermenting the wort. It was about creating something that would sustain not only the body but the soul as well. In monasteries and convents, brewing beer was treated as a sacred act, a form of worship through work. The brewing process, which could take days or weeks, was infused with religious meaning. Monks and nuns would often pray as they brewed, offering their work to God as an expression of gratitude for the gifts of nature, the barley, the hops, and the water that they used to create the beer. In some convents, beer was brewed specifically for religious celebrations and feasts. These special brews were often reserved for sacred occasions, such as the feast days of saints or important religious holidays. The beer brewed for these occasions was crafted with great care and attention to detail, using the finest ingredients and sometimes incorporating special herbs or spices. These sacred brews were seen as offerings to God and were consumed as part of the religious rituals that marked these important events. Brewing, then, was not just an economic activity, it was an integral part of the religious life of the convent, a way for nuns to honor God through their work. This intersection of sacred and secular is what makes the brewing practices of monks and nuns so unique. While brewing beer was a necessity for sustaining their communities, it was also an expression of their religious devotion. The act of brewing beer became a form of prayer, a way to give thanks for the harvest, for the water, and for the ability to craft something that would nourish both the body and the soul. The spiritual dimension of brewing was recognized by both monks and nuns, who saw their work as part of their religious mission. Brewing was not just about producing beer. It was about producing something that could sustain the body and spirit, contributing to the health and well-being of the community. While the monks and nuns were engaged in similar brewing practices, their motivations and outcomes were shaped by different aspects of their religious lives. For monks, the brewing process was often part of a broader system of self-sufficiency, with beer being brewed in large quantities to sustain the community and fund religious activities. The beer brewed by monks was practical and nourishing, with an emphasis on consistency and efficiency. The focus was on providing sustenance for the monastery and the community, and brewing was seen as a service to God. For nuns, however, brewing beer was a more personal and intimate activity. The smaller scale of convent life allowed nuns to focus on the finer points of brewing, experimenting with ingredients and techniques to create beer that was both nourishing and flavorful. The addition of medicinal herbs and flowers to their brews was a reflection of their broader religious mission to care for the sick and the needy. Brewing beer became a way for nuns to serve their community, offering a drink that was not only enjoyable but also beneficial to health. The act of brewing was a way for the nuns to fulfill their religious vows, offering their work as a form of devotion to God. While the monks may have dominated large-scale brewing operations, the nuns' contributions to brewing should not be underestimated. Their focus on quality, their use of medicinal herbs, and their attention to detail in the brewing process made their beer a prized commodity. They may not have brewed in the same quantities as the monks, but their beers were of exceptional quality with flavors and medicinal properties that set them apart. The nuns' brewing innovations focused on both flavor and healing, helped to elevate beer to something more than just a functional drink. In conclusion, the connection between religion and brewing in both monasteries and convents underscores the importance of beer in medieval society. Brewing was not just a way to sustain the body, it was an act of religious devotion and service. For both monks and nuns, brewing beer was a way to honor God, care for the community, and fulfill their religious vows. The sacred and secular were intertwined in the brewing process, and it is through this blend of spiritual purpose and practical necessity that both monks and nuns made lasting contributions to the world of brewing. Section 14. Beer as a sacred gift. Monastic and convent rituals. In medieval Europe, beer wasn't simply a drink to be consumed casually. It was a sacred gift that played an integral role in both religious and communal life. The brewing of beer was deeply intertwined with the religious rituals of both monks and nuns. It was seen not only as a means of nourishment, but also as a way to serve God and their communities, making the act of brewing an extension of their devotion. For both the monks and the nuns, beer was more than just a product, it was a ritual, a form of worship and a symbol of divine grace. Monks, as part of their monastic vows, sought to create a self-sustaining life within their monasteries. Their daily routine was punctuated by prayer work and communal meals, and beer was often a vital component of that routine. Brewing beer to monks was an extension of their labor for God. It was a task that allowed them to contribute to the broader needs of society, providing sustenance for the monastery pilgrims and the surrounding community. The act of brewing was infused with a sense of purpose and reverence as the monks would often pray and chant during the brewing process. Brewing beer, much like farming or manuscript copying, was a way to honor God through productive labor. The process of brewing itself became a form of prayer. Monks would view each step of the brewing process, mashing, boiling, fermenting, as a spiritual exercise working with the materials given to them by God. In this way, brewing beer was more than just a physical task, it was a spiritual one as well. It was a way for the monks to give thanks for the resources they had, from the grains of barley to the hops that flavored their beer. The beer itself was viewed as a blessing, a gift that nourished not just the body, but the soul. This spiritual connection to brewing was so strong that many monastic communities even considered their beer to be a kind of sacrament, something holy and vital for the community's well-being. In the same way, nuns approached brewing with a sense of sacred duty, but with a distinct focus on care, healing, and nurturing. While monks brewed in large quantities to feed their community, nuns brewed smaller batches that were often infused with herbs and other medicinal ingredients. Their beer was seen as not only a drink, but a means of healing and restoration, and the act of brewing was treated with the same reverence as their other religious duties. For the nuns, brewing was not just about economic necessity, it was about creating a drink that could bring comfort and well-being to others. Nuns, who were often responsible for tending the sick and caring for the elderly, would incorporate their knowledge of medicinal herbs into their brewing. Herbs like chamomile, rosemary, and thyme were used to give their beers not only flavor but therapeutic benefits. These beers were brewed with the intent to aid digestion, soothe the nerves, and generally restore health. Brewing beer in the convent was seen as an extension of the nuns' healing work, which was integral to their religious mission. By brewing beer that was nourishing and healing, nuns fulfilled their vow of service to others, offering a product that could help both body and soul. This connection between brewing and healing was especially important in a time when medicine was rudimentary and often unreliable. The nuns' use of herbs in their brewing process gave their beer a unique place in medieval society, something more than just a beverage. It was a restorative drink that people sought out not only for refreshment, but for its healing qualities. The act of brewing was sacred because it represented the nuns' dedication to caring for the community, both physically and spiritually. Beer, brewed by monks and nuns, also played an important role in religious rituals. During major feasts or feast days dedicated to saints or important religious events, beer brewed in the monastery or convent was often consumed as part of the celebration. These sacred occasions provided an opportunity for monks and nuns to gather together and partake in the blessings of their labor. The beer was not only consumed as a social drink, but also as an offering, a symbolic representation of the fruits of their devotion. In some monasteries, beer was even considered a sacred part of the meal, a holy drink that connected the community to the divine. Nuns, in particular, had a unique role in this aspect of religious ritual. Since convents were often smaller and more intimate, the nuns would brew special batches of beer reserved for religious ceremonies. These brews were sometimes brewed with rare herbs or ingredients and were treated as sacred offerings. The beer would be consumed not only to honor the feast day, but also as a symbol of the community's devotion to God and to the service they provided to each other. The act of sharing beer in these sacred rituals strengthened the bonds between the nuns and their communities, reinforcing the idea that beer was not just a drink, but a shared blessing. In many ways, the beer brewed by monks and nuns was a reflection of the dual nature of their religious lives. On one hand, beer was a practical necessity, a drink that could sustain them, physically providing nourishment during long hours of work and prayer. On the other hand, it was a sacred offering, a gift from God that nourished not only the body, but also the soul. Beer was a symbol of the grace of God, something that could bring the community together in prayer, in celebration, and in healing. Brewing beer for both monks and nuns was an act of devotion, and the product of their labor was seen as a sacred gift, one that nourished both the physical and spiritual well-being of those who consumed it. Today, as we reflect on the history of beer, we can trace the roots of modern brewing back to these medieval monastic and convent traditions. The beers, brewed by monks and nuns, may have been made for different purposes, but they were both deeply connected to the sacred rituals of religious life. Whether it was the monks' large-scale production to sustain their community, or the nuns' small-batch medicinal brews beer in the medieval period, was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of faith, a tool for healing, and a testament to the sacred bond between labor devotion and service. In the end, the sacred nature of brewing beer in medieval monasteries and convents demonstrates how intertwined religious life was, with even the most mundane aspects of daily existence. For monks and nuns alike, brewing was an act of service, an expression of care, and a means to share the blessings of their labor with the wider community. Beer, as a sacred gift, represented the harmony between the sacred and the secular, nourishing both body and soul, and helping to bind communities together in faith, fellowship and ritual. Section 15. The Decline of Nun Brewed Beer. As we've seen, the nuns played an important and innovative role in the medieval beer industry, crafting beers that were not only functional, but also flavorful and medicinal. Their smaller, more intimate brewing operations allowed them to focus on quality and refine their brewing techniques, setting their beers apart from the mass-produced brews of the monks. However, the decline of nun-brewed beer and the eventual overshadowing of their contribution to brewing is a story of societal changes, shifting economic systems, and the gradual male dominance of the brewing industry. One of the primary factors contributing to the decline of nun-brewed beer was the increasing dominance of male-controlled brewing institutions. As beer production became more industrialized and the demand for mass production grew, monasteries expanded their brewing operations to meet the needs of larger populations. Monks, with their access to large-scale facilities and labor, were able to brew beer in quantities that nuns working in smaller convents simply could not match. The sheer scale of monk-brewed beer production outpaced the more refined artisanal efforts of the nuns, pushing their beers to the periphery of the beer market. Moreover, as beer production became more commercialized, the role of women in brewing began to be marginalized. Brewing, which had once been a task performed by women in homes, villages, and convents, became increasingly male-dominated. The rise of commercial breweries often run by men meant that women's contributions to brewing were overlooked or forgotten. The shift toward larger, more profit-driven brewing operations was not just a matter of economics. It was a reflection of broader societal changes in which women's roles in industries like brewing were relegated to the background. By the late medieval period and into the early modern era, brewing beer was seen less as an art form and more as a commercial venture. The industrialization of beer production with new methods of mass production and distribution reduced the role of the nuns, who could no longer compete with the efficiency and scale of male-run breweries. While the nuns had once brewed beer as a form of service care and devotion, the growing commercial interests in brewing were more focused on profits and efficiency than on quality and community service. The decline of nun-brewed beer can also be linked to the broader changes in the religious landscape. In the late medieval period, the Catholic Church began to consolidate power, and monastic institutions, including convents, faced increasing scrutiny and regulation. Monasteries and convents, once relatively independent and self-sustaining, began to lose their autonomy as the Church centralized its control. This made it harder for convents to maintain their brewing operations, and many nuns were forced to scale back their beer production or abandon it altogether. In addition, the Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, led to significant changes in religious and social structures. The Reformation challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, and, by extension, the role of convents and monasteries in society. Protestantism promoted the idea that beer should be brewed for practical secular purposes rather than as a religious or medicinal product. This shift in religious ideology further pushed the nuns' brewing practices out of the mainstream, as beer became increasingly viewed as a commodity to be produced by men, not women. The rise of large commercial breweries, coupled with the societal and religious changes of the Reformation, made it increasingly difficult for nuns to maintain their brewing traditions. Their small-scale operations, which had once been successful because of their focus on quality, were now overshadowed by the more profitable large-scale breweries that could produce beer faster and at lower costs. The nuns' beers, once considered a luxury, became niche products enjoyed only by those who remembered their therapeutic benefits. The market for nun-brewed beer slowly disappeared as male-dominated breweries took over the brewing industry. Yet, despite the decline of Nun Brewed beer, the legacy of the nuns' contribution to brewing should not be forgotten. Their innovations in beer making, particularly the use of medicinal herbs, and the focus on quality laid the foundation for modern craft brewing. Today, as craft brewers experiment with herbs, spices, and unique brewing methods, they are essentially picking up where the nuns left off centuries ago. The artisanal methods developed by nuns in their convents methods focused on creativity, quality, and healing continue to influence the brewing industry today. The decline of nun-brewed beer is a reflection of broader societal shifts, but it also speaks to the resilience and innovation of women in the face of institutional and economic pressures. Nuns, with their focus on creating healing, flavorful beers, helped shape the brewing industry in ways that have been largely forgotten by history. While monks may have dominated the large-scale production of beer, the nuns' contribution to the craft of brewing was equally important, and their beers, while no longer widely consumed, were a vital part of medieval life. In conclusion, the decline of nun-brewed beer is not just a story of economic shifts and societal changes, it's a story of gender power and the evolution of the brewing industry. The nuns' focus on quality medicinal properties and care for the community helped them produce some of the finest beers of the medieval period. However, as beer production became more commercialized and industrialized, their small-scale operations were eclipsed by the larger, more efficient breweries controlled by men. Despite this, the legacy of nun-brewed beer lives on in the modern craft beer movement, where the nuns' emphasis on quality, creativity, and healing continues to inspire brewers around the world. Section 16. A Sip of History. The Last Drop. As we near the end of our journey into the world of medieval brewing, it's time to reflect on the lasting impact of both monks and nuns on the beer industry. While the monks are often credited with laying the groundwork for large-scale beer production, it was the nuns who, with their focus on quality innovation and the integration of medicinal herbs, created beers that were far ahead of their time. Nuns and monks alike were integral to the development of beer, as both a vital sustenance and a revered drink. But their contributions to brewing were shaped by the unique environments and roles that defined their lives. The nuns' story in brewing is a quiet one, overshadowed by the more prominent history of monk-brewed beer. Yet it is equally significant. The nuns were innovators, pioneering a brewing style that combined artistry with healing flavor with function. Their focus on small-scale production, refined techniques, and the addition of medicinal herbs set them apart from the monks' larger, more industrialized brewing efforts. But, as we've seen, their contributions were often overlooked as brewing became more commercialized and male-dominated. Despite this, the influence of nun-brewed beer can still be felt today. Modern craft brewing has experienced a resurgence in recent decades, with many brewers emphasizing small-batch production experimentation with ingredients and a focus on quality values that were central to the nuns' brewing philosophy. Craft brewers, who often use unique herbs, spices, and fruits in their beers, are essentially continuing the tradition of the nuns reviving their innovative approach to brewing. This connection between the past and the present highlights the enduring legacy of the nuns' contributions to the brewing world. As we look back at the medieval brewing landscape, we can appreciate that the history of beer is not just a story of monks brewing large quantities of beer for sustenance. It is also a story of nuns who created a beer that was nourishing, restorative, and artfully crafted. Their beer was more than just a drink. It was a testament to their commitment to care, healing, and devotion. The nuns, with their focus on quality and innovation, helped to shape the future of beer, even if their contributions were not widely acknowledged until recently. The last drop of Nuns Brewed beer may have been consumed centuries ago, but the essence of their brewing practices lives on. The craft beer movement, which values small batch production, flavor experimentation, and quality over quantity, owes a great deal to the nuns of medieval Europe. Their approach to beer making laid the foundation for what we now know as artisanal and craft brewing, a movement that continues to grow and thrive today. In a sense, the story of Nuns Brewed beer is a story of resilience of women who, despite being overshadowed by male-dominated institutions, found ways to innovate and contribute to the world of brewing. Their creativity, dedication, and focus on quality beer helped shape the future of the industry, and their legacy is being rediscovered by modern brewers who continue to honor their contributions. So, as you sip your next craft beer, take a moment to remember the nuns who centuries ago brewed with a sense of care, devotion, and innovation. Their beers may have been lost to history, but their influence lives on in every carefully crafted brew, every small batch experiment, and every beer made with a passion for flavor and quality. The history of beer is a complex, multifaceted story, a story of monks and nuns, of devotion and creativity, of tradition and innovation. And as we continue to explore this rich history, we are reminded that beer is not just a drink. It is a part of the tapestry of human culture, a beverage that has sustained and connected people for centuries. From its humble beginnings in monasteries and convents to its modern-day status as a global industry, beer has come a long way. But the contributions of those early brewers, especially the nuns, continue to resonate today, reminding us of the timeless connection between brewing healing and care. As the last drop of history settles, let's raise a glass in honor of those who perfected the craft before us, the monks, the nuns, and all the brewers who came before. Their devotion to brewing, their innovations in flavor and technique, and their legacy continue to shape the beer industry we know today. Good night.